Thank you, Phil. Yeah, 20 years. It won't take me 20 years to run through it, but those of you that know me know it might take longer than it's supposed to. Often on these occasions, people look back at what happened in those first formative years. And I'm like everybody else, I look back at what was going on in 2003. And two key points I think I'd like to raise now. Firstly, the last flight of Concorde happened in 2003, arguably the most polluting, high carbon form of transport we can actually come across. So that was the last flight. A complete counterpoint to that, Greta Thunberg was born in 2003 as well. And I think that, that brings me on to what I'd really like to start with, which is actually an apology. It's an apology to my mother. Someone, clearly I respect and adore. And she actually studied history and classics, Latin, ancient Greek, things like that. And for most of my formative years, I spent my time berating her for looking in the past and referring to dead languages and things like this. Standing here 40 years later and looking back at the last 20 years of Zemo and our top 20 highlights that you can see behind me, the similarities of where we find ourselves today are, quite frankly, unnerving compared with where we were 20 years ago. And I can look back and see very clearly how, by looking back and learning, we actually can move forward much faster. And I think it's that I want to really focus on as we go through. In 2002, 2003, we had never heard of a ULEZ. We'd never heard of a ULEV either. But what we did do was create a critical and unique action and advisory group. And I'm going to actually reflect back on some of the targets that were set for the partnership when we were created. The partnership will encourage industries and other stakeholders to engage proactively in the move to low-carbon vehicles and fuels, building on informed and shared knowledge of prospective technology developments and the supply chain demands and opportunities which the new technologies will generate. It will provide a forum in which stakeholders can work together in overcoming market barrier issues affecting the shift to new vehicles and fuels. It will provide a forum for government, industry and other partners to liaise on upcoming policy, regulatory issues, national, EU and other. And this will ensure that government and partners keep closely in touch and also assist government in taking a proactive role in international developments, initiating action where necessary. And it will provide government with independent input and feedback, particularly on problems and obstacles hindering the move to new vehicles and fuels, ways of dealing with them, and the progress and effectiveness of government programs. And I would say that, we have not been in a situation for the last 20 years more like we were back then in 2002. And through the very turbulent times we've had, certainly recently, I think the stability and the consistency of that independent partnership has provided government, industry, and consumers with the confidence to move forward together. From the outset, climate change and air quality were inextricably linked. And throughout that, we even ran a campaign on cleaner air and lower carbon as one of our highlights. And it's therefore no coincidence today that we're here on Clean Air Day to keep that collaborative flag flying high. I'm also very proud that I was there at the start, playing my part in the inception, conception even, and very proud, I'm very proud to see quite so many faces, most of whom have aged an awful lot better than I have over the last 20 years, but those faces that have been part of that journey with us over that whole period. I think you too will see the incredibly strong parallels between those heady days of the early 2000s and the challenges we face today. As another nod to my mother's linguistics and probably another apology for my pronunciation, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. The more things change, the more they stay the same. In 2003 at Millbank, on the back of a powering future vehicles, or a strategy for powering up Britain's future vehicles, powering up Britain seems to resonate. The Automotive Innovation and Growth Team had identified low carbon as the opportunity for UK automotive to lead a global shift. Sounds familiar. Government made the UK the first to commit to shifting its mainstream motoring to low carbon technology. We're the first to set a net zero agenda and to commit to zero emission vehicles. And it also clearly identified that this could only be delivered through partnership between vehicle and fuel industries, consumer and environmental groups, the finance and investment communities, local government, the R&D and academic groups, transport operators, and many, many other stakeholders. So Low CVP was born, and from the outset, we've had targets. Initially for 10% of new cars to be low carbon, and that was then defined as being below 100 grams per kilometre CO2. And we also had a target for 600 sales of new low carbon emission buses. Today, of course, we have a ZEV mandate for cars, and we've got a target for 4,000 zero emission buses by the end of 2024. And the similarities don't stop there. Many may not remember, but actually in that Powering Future Vehicles strategy, we also set a target for 10% of new car sales in 2020 to be ultra low carbon cars. The similarity with today is the fact that we didn't have a definition of ultra low carbon. ESSEC, anybody? The automotive industry was facing a huge change in focus, with new fuels and technologies driving upheaval in the supply chain and manufacturing in order to produce these low carbon cars. But alongside this, encouraging consumers to buy them was recognised as a critical component for success. And that really brings us to one of our first major milestones, the New Car Fuel Economy label. But I think it's important to note this was never a regulation introduced by government or a standard set by consumer groups. This was actually a true example of the power of partnership, with the major legwork in this case done by the automotive industry itself, SMMT working through the partnership and developing and introducing a solution, and then actually even monitoring and enforcing its adoption. Only later did that label fall into regulation and get adopted both here in the UK and latterly in the EU. And of course, we face the same challenges today, getting every driver to want to drive a zero-emission vehicle. And together, we're again working on the EV information, the labelling and the charging and consumer engagement, and trying to lead from the front, again with the SMMT, the VCA, and of course, the ChargePoint UK community, and indeed those consumer-facing colleagues like Ginny, who's here later, and electrifying.com. We've got Paul Clark here. We've got people who communicate these things, and we need that absolutely, because we all know that encouraging drivers to make the case to switch themselves will always be better than trying to force them with a solution on a reluctant laggard. Another key activity that Low CVP was tasked with was to report annually to the Parliamentary Low Carbon Ministerial Group on progress. It was actually 5 years into our existence that the law really caught up and the Climate Change Act was passed, and that mandated low carbon targets for 2050. The Climate Change Committee was formed, and we'll hear from Chris in a moment, of course, so I won't steal his thunder. But today, the parallels with the net zero legislation that came in 2019 maintain that same focus on our 2050 future. An area I feel the partnership has always rightly focused on is the independent and inquisitive approach that we've taken to establishing what truly low carbon and sustainable really mean. So throughout, alternative fuels of all types have been a mainstay of the partnership's success over those 20 years. And they remain one of our most active areas today. In July 2003, the Fuels Group was formed, and they discussed developing a strategy for low carbon transport fuels. Sounds familiar. Placing it in the context of an overall energy strategy and considering the role of hydrogen and CO2 sequestration. And indeed, 20 years ago, that group reflected, and I'm going to quote from that group 20 years ago, it reflected on the UK's unique high excise duty, which provides scope for economic stimuli that should be harnessed via fuel taxation based on carbon content. I'm sure that resonates with a few people in the audience today. But the partnership's early work on the carbon and sustainability standards for biofuels actually became the platform on which all future policy for fuels, including the RTFO that we have today, and in fact reported again this morning, and indeed the EU renewable fuel standards would all be based on that early work. Even then, we realised how interconnected these aspects were, with fuel, infrastructure and vehicles all needing to work in harmony with the consumers. So back in 2003, we actually arranged our first fuels and passenger car groups to meet on the same day to build bridges and to break down silos from day one. Just for information, our passenger car and EV infrastructure working groups are meeting together in a month's time. A real example of the success of the role of the partnership was the introduction of E10 into the UK fuel market in 2021. This actually had been one of the longest projects we'd run, and very often at Zemo we don't really talk in years, we talk in transport ministers. I think I'm right in saying this was a 6-minister project. But the fact that it actually happened almost seamlessly from a consumer and customer perspective, delivering what was then arguably the biggest single carbon saving in one-step change in transport. And that's a testament to not only the tenacity of our members throughout that process, but also the effectiveness of working together, however long it takes. Perhaps the jewel in our crown for the last 20 years has been our bus working group, meeting actually in December 2002 before the low CVP itself was officially formed. But even at that first meeting, we discussed the industrial benefit of UK bus OEMs and working with local councils and potential low emission zones. We were also talking about whole life cost challenges and the BSOG fuel duty rebate. They both featured in that early 2002 meeting, as they do indeed today during the bus working group. But the success of that community, developing and setting new standards for buses based on real world cycles, with right from the outset a focus on a well-to-wheel approach and more latterly a life cycle approach, embracing the fuel, the vehicle and all that entails. These were world-leading standards. And with that initial Green Bus Fund in 2009, the partnership and the UK bus community have led the way on low carbon, ultra low carbon, zero emission funding and support, such that today we are seen as the leading light for zero emission bus assessment and adoption. And also at this point, I really should acknowledge the role that the GLA and TfL had in developing and helping that whole bus sector and our work within it. And now trucks must be our next focus for concerted collaborative effort. And having chaired the Commercial Vehicle Working Group and been an active participant for many years, the sector has focused more over that period on the incremental gains and the operational efficiencies, all of which of course are crucial, but step change carbon reduction has been slow to materialise. The partnership's role in promoting renewable fuel solutions via the incredibly successful Renewable Fuel Assurance Scheme and supporting the demonstration of a range of technologies in low carbon trucks and low emission freight trials since 2012 has been key to paving the way for the next big demonstration of zero tailpipe emission HGVs, which I'm sure will be announced shortly, looking at Bob. And these trials actually also bring me to a key learning point I also want to highlight. And it's as relevant today as it was when we started. And that is that we don't know all the answers. And even more important, we often can't predict the future. One of the first technology roadmaps that was used as an input to the formation of the partnership identified the possible timelines for technology to roll out towards 2015 at that point. Biofuels, natural gas, hybrids, they were all well mapped and actually have delivered very much to the timeline that was suggested. But in 2002, the prediction was that hydrogen in both fuel cell and combustion would be the generally available technology in 2012. And the roadmap went on to say that electric vehicles would have limited future use. How wrong we all were. But actually how well we've all adapted to the rapid technology shift. And that too, I feel, is a reflection on a community working together, listening and learning at every step and not sticking blindly to an outdated vision of the future. Of course, electrification can't happen in transport without the infrastructure to support it. And as the media will remind us at every chance they get, this infrastructure isn't yet fit for purpose. But actually, that challenge is probably at least as big a task as the reinvention within the automotive sector that we're facing. And it needs the same scale of collaborative approach if it is to be delivered. Again, the partnership rose to this challenge to bring the sectors together to form an EV network in 2018, which government quickly embraced, and it morphed into the EV Energy Task Force, reaching over 350 members, working the details of what needs to be delivered to ensure that energy and infrastructure is not a barrier to uptake. The success of this group, I feel, can be seen in the fact that unlike the mainstream media message, our charging infrastructure is actually growing faster than EV sales in 2023. And it's genuinely starting to fulfill the mantra of Yvette to build the infrastructure ahead of need. So I think perhaps my final and arguably most important point should also be from the predictions made in 2003, in this case by government. In 2003, it was predicted that road transport carbon emissions would rise by 30% in the period to 2020. Together, we've actually reversed that trend, and the provisional figure for 2022 that I looked at last night shows that transport is 15% lower than it was in 2003. Still, of course, it's the biggest contributor and one of the most difficult to change, but it's also therefore the biggest opportunity. And, as we all know, one of the most exciting and evolving areas. And I think we should all celebrate the success of our hard work. If we've jointly managed to move the dial by almost 50% in the last 20 years, just by looking back and learning, maybe we genuinely can meet the net zero target over the next 20 years through partnership. And partnership is all about people. So I want to finish as I began, and I apologise to my mother, and what I'd like to do is maybe also give my daughters some advice. Surround yourself with smart and enthusiastic people, and then listen and learn from their experience, and hopefully you too can make some great things happen for all of our collective futures. Thank you very much.